Alright, I think now I want to talk about a movie that is in no way controversial whatsoever. Obviously, we've had a few versions of Godfather 3. There was the original one, which I think is like 162 minutes or something. And then there's the one that these days probably most people knew prior to the re-edit, which was the one that was in the box set, which was the 170-minute version, which is like the final director's cut or something. But then, much like Coppola movies in general, there's always going to be another version at some point. So now we have The Godfather Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone, that came out at the end of last year, December of last year, which was considered the whole definitive final thing, and was Coppola going in the direction he'd always wanted to go, because he initially wanted Godfather Part III to be called The Death of Michael Corleone at the start, and Paramount didn't like that very much, so they really wanted to cash in on the Part 3 thing. So, and he has a little intro at the start of the Coda where he talks about how the whole idea was basically not for it to be a Part 3, but for it to just be like an epilogue, hence its title, and how it was basically like, I think his wording was, the illumination of what the other two movies were. And I get that vibe, but, because here, what I was gonna initially do here was like kind of a versus thing, where it's like, how does, the 170-minute version, work and not work, and then did the Coda fix these certain things or whatever, and just go back and forth on, how that was handled. But I figured the easy way, because there's really not many changes. There's obviously the changes at the beginning and the changes at the end, and then in the middle it's mostly like really subtle editing choices or music choices or something like that. Like the only two things I feel like I really noticed prior to looking up the changes was his whole scene at Tomasino's funeral is cut down, and then I was sure, I wasn't sure until I looked it up, but I was pretty sure that what's his name, Lucchese's death scene is bloodier. And apart from that, the beginning and the end were the only things that I noticed until I looked them up. And they are very subtle. Like that's a conversation you want to have with like a professional editor, if you want to go into all those details and how those work. And there's plenty of interviews out there with Coppola when this one was coming out, some of which Pacino and Garcia are involved in also. So I would seek those out if you're looking for something about the editing and all that. Though it's been about 9 months since this came out, so surely you've already done that if that was your intention. So you've already sought all that stuff out. And this is just some extra thing that I'm doing for whatever reason, because I want to, I guess. Yeah, I think I'm just going to make this a general, just me talking about The Godfather 3 in general, and then when we're talking about like whatever the changes are, when they come up, they'll come up. And actually they come up immediately, because, like I was saying, the first big one is at the start, in the beginning, the one that makes perfect sense. Because I remember, because when you look at Godfather 3 in general, it's got this very, very clear reputation. Like, it seems like everybody you talk to about Godfather 3 has a prepared script that everybody in the world has. The whole thing of how it's really not that bad, it's just that it's not the other two, it's not even close to being the other two. Sofia Coppola's performance is really, really bad, and all that stuff. It's the same conversations. The whole Vincent Mary storyline should be cut out entirely. It's been the same thing for over 30 years now. And, the reason it's been that way is because, yeah, most of those things are pretty much all those things are pretty accurate. But to look at it from a bit more of a detailed stance is what we're going here for. Even, there's some people that have been defensive of it, like going on, like, for some reason the first thing that comes to mind is going all the way back to the first season of The Sopranos. There's the moment where Godfather 3 comes up and Joaquin Woodbine's character says, "I think it was just misunderstood." And it's like, to think that in 1999 we already had people kind of going in that direction. when the movie was only 9 years old. But and you still have those people that are like, no, really, it's not that bad if you watch it by itself, and with like no, like hardly any like just enough context to remember who everybody is and what their connections are. In that case, it's not that bad. But the thing about when I saw it when I was younger was I just kind of remember being bored with it, like not really thinking it's really bad or anything, or endlessly comparing it to the other two, but just the way the story felt so disjointed and kind of immediately. And there was a lot of like things were confusing that probably weren't supposed to be confusing or weren't intended to be. Um, and that can really throw you off, especially when it's like right away and the movie's nearly 3 hours. Um, if you get off on the wrong foot, it's going to take a long time to recover from that, or may not recover at all. So I think that might be what the main problem with Godfather 3 is, as far as, like, I mean, there's other things that we'll get into, but as far as, like, getting off on the wrong foot immediately. So naturally, that's the first thing that's fixed in the Coda, where we get the introduction of him talking to the Archbishop. And the thing about that is how much, even though he's had to come to somebody else's location instead of the other way around, it still has that classic feel from the first two, where we're eventually going to have a sort of reception, which has been common at the beginning of the first two movies. And then the idea of just seeing the Godfather do business at this event of sorts. And the only way it's broken up is obviously Michael starts off in a different place and then we get that reception. But still, this having this scene that was like 40 minutes in to the regular version, now being the opening scene, already feels like, okay, we're kind of back in that vibe now. Like, obviously, we're not going to reach 1 and 2. And it's like, you kind of just got to leave that at the door, because that's just not going to happen. But getting off on that right foot, where it feels like, okay, yes, this is the kind of thing we came for. Basically, to watch, the business aspect of it is the most intriguing parts of the whole thing. Just seeing how they handle business and what the conflicts that keep coming up are, whether they're going to be small and kind of like their own almost kind of episodic thing, or if it's going to be something that's going to be overarching through the whole movie. Either one always is really engrossing and really pulls you in and sets you into the world that Coppola really built with these movies. And yeah, so in this one, once we get to the reception, we are going to be seeing people, coming in and out. And some of them we might recognize, and some of them will be new characters, especially since we've had a pretty significant time jump compared to the last one. Not counting the flashback scenes of the second one. But, yeah, so obviously most of the family is here. Somebody that is clearly missing is Duvall, and a lot of people also chalk up to there's definitely a big gap in this movie with Duvall not being here. And it's almost like they tried to cover it up in two different ways, neither of which are that effective. The main one, of course, bringing in George Hamilton, of all people. And it's like, I don't know if this was just... and I don't really have anything against George Hamilton otherwise. And it's like, I feel like he could easily fit in this world as a smaller character, like as a not near as crucial character. So here, him being so prominent and like in the place of Duvall makes him stand out in a way that's not... I mean, it's not even really necessarily that he stands out in a bad way, it's that he doesn't really stand out at all. Which, once again, for this role, this gap that needs to be filled in, is... Yeah, I mean, and you can say it's dead on arrival, trying to even fill in a gap left by Duvall. Specifically, his performances as Tom, which would also make sense. But another thing they do here, to kind of... Because I guess the thing you've got to remember is the fact that this is 1990 when it came out. 79 being the setting. But in 1990 when it came out, it wasn't like the way we are now, where we're getting movie news constantly. Like, anytime anything changes in a movie's production, we know about it, like, instantly. So when we go into a movie, we know pretty much everything to expect as far as like what's going to be in it. And I'm guessing people in 1990 going into this movie, some of them needed to have it explained to them. By the way, Robert Duvall is not in this movie. So we have this John Savage character, who is his son, who just kind of walks in and out of this movie with hardly any... I don't even know that he does much of anything. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't really remember anything this character did other than pop in and out and say, "Hey, Uncle Michael." There's even a scene that's practically comical when we've met him, like, he's just hanging around the reception, and then he gets that breakfast scene where he just walks in and he says, "Oh, your father didn't live to see you ordained," and then he leaves, and it's like, that's the portion that's just saying, "Hey, audience, Robert Duvall's not in the movie, sorry." And that's all it's there for. He comes in and then he walks right back out. And then there is another scene later where Michael is leaving, and he just materializes, and he's like, "Hey, Uncle Michael," and just starts walking by with them, and then it fades out. The character is useless. The character is only here, like I said, unless I'm forgetting some crucial detail, the only reason he's here is so you could get that exposition out. Tom Hagen is dead, apparently. Because they weren't giving Robert Duvall enough money. So that's that's very clumsily done. And talking about, it establishing the absence of Hagen, if there's one thing that probably shouldn't have been clumsily done, that would be at the top of the list as far as this movie goes. But another thing here that's really interesting is, well, actually, before we get to the interesting stuff, we'll also mention some of the other returning characters. And it's nice that even if they're only there for like a second, some of the returning characters to kind of keep, like bringing you back into the world or reintroducing you to the world is nice. Like when Johnny Fontaine is there, Enzo the Baker is there. And this is obviously much later. This is like the middle of the movie, but bringing Tomasino back into it as well. And that's the thing also, if you want to talk about the overarch of the whole movie, is the whole idea being that this is like the end of an era, with us reaching the death, whether it be whichever version you're watching, whether it be the spiritual death or the actual physical death of Michael. Something that I feel like gets a little I mean, not necessarily downplayed because it propels us into the climax, but the death of Tomasino, as unceremonious as it is, which is fine because there's there's very theatrical deaths throughout this series. There's also very crucial deaths that are very unceremonious, like Vito's, which is like Vito Corleone has like had the ultimate unceremonious death for as major of a character as he is and an iconic character as he is. But with all of the history, and plus everything we saw in Part 2 and the flashbacks, it feels like the death of Tomasino is just as much like, when you want to talk about like watching an era die or seeing the end of an era as far as these characters and how long some of them have been around, like it was... Tomasino's death seems to signify the end of an era that predates Michael entirely, which I find very interesting. And like I said, it's sort of unceremoniously done, but at the same time it is like kind of our one stepping stone to get to the climax, so there is that. But I feel like that gets underplayed a little bit, because I really like how really crucial it is that character is in this movie and plays the prominent role that he does, and then meets that ultimate fate. And then we've got stuff, some of the stuff that people don't like. Like I guess we'll just go ahead and go into the Vincent and Mary thing. Well, as far as Vincent goes, I do think Vincent's a very strong character. It could easily be seen as, like, obviously he is the son of Sonny, and just immediately as soon as he enters the movie, which he does, he's introduced quicker in the Coda, and I think kind of establishes himself a little more in how those scenes are put together, versus the other version. But you do get that sense immediately when you see him, where it's like, you would have this real comfort and familiarity of like, oh yeah, that's definitely, like, because you know the character so well, it's, oh, that is definitely something. Like, you can just see him interact with somebody in the first 10 seconds that we've met him, and it's like, yeah, that's Sonny's kid for sure. You could potentially also chalk that up to is it, when you're talking about characters being replaced with other newer characters, and it's more like him being just kind of a Sonny surrogate might make him feel a bit more, would have made him feel a bit more of an empty character, and it's just like, oh, he's just filling in that gap. But I think Garcia brings more than enough to it to establish him as his own character and an interesting character, even if he does have most of Sonny's characteristics, all the way up to the whole idea of the assassination of Joey Zaza, where it's like we get that whole same structure of he's really hot-headed, it's like this person has got to go, and the person in charge, in this case now Michael, says, no, you just don't do that, don't get involved in that, it's not worth it. It's like, because Michael doesn't even take Joey Zaza seriously, so it's like, just don't bother with that, just let it go. And then the second Michael is out of commission, after he has his stroke, Vincent takes action, which is exactly what happened with Sonny in the first movie. So, like, if the second the Godfather's out of commission, the hot-headed one will do his own thing, and cause havoc, and ultimately, potentially, some sort of domino effect. Not as fateful as Sonny's, but because interestingly enough, Vincent survives the movie, which has always been kind of surprising to me in retrospect, but also makes sense. Because there's the sort of... Well, I don't know, if you want to talk about it as a full-on ending, and like full-on closure, they could have maybe gone down that road, but as far as it strictly being Michael's story, and like as soon as Michael's story comes to its end, we literally don't need to see anything else. Like, the movie just literally ends. Right when it's determined that Michael's redemption is not coming. So that's another thing. Oh shit! I keep straying away before we get to Mary. I swear that's not on purpose. But rather symbolic, perhaps. I guess. I don't get. Maybe I've just seen the movie enough times now that I'm used to it. I just don't really get that super bent out of shape about Sofia Coppola's performance. And I will. There's been plenty of bad performance that I just loathe the sight of. But I don't know if it's just the whole thing that's been surrounding this performance for so long also. But it's like whenever you go back to it after years and years of not seeing it, you're always like, is she going to be even worse than I remember or something like that? And it's like, it's not... I mean, she's bad. She has terrible line deliveries. And for being such a crucial character, that's a setback. But I think the reason that I don't just seethe with rage about that is that this whole other storyline kind of bogs down the whole Mary thing anyway. The her and Vincent storyline, which once again isn't something that I really hate, it's just something that I don't know. There was another way, there are surely many other ways to make Vincent tighter with the family, or have some sort of conflict with the family. I think that was going to be Hagen's whole storyline before they had to write Duvall out, was about him getting involved with the feds and stuff like that. Which you really could have taken the old Hagen storyline and kind of made it composite with what Vincent's got going on. But we got to do this Mary thing, so there's that. There is a scene that I like. I don't know if I like the scene as it plays out and as it's written, or if I just like the concept of the scene. But it's the scene when they're talking about, like, Sonny's past and, like, the whole thing of, did Michael really have Fredo killed and stuff like that. And it's that idea of seeing... I was actually basically talking about this same kind of thing with the new Candyman, where it's like, the stuff that we know, and know very well from the original movies, is now mythology amongst the new characters. And I always find that kind of thing really interesting amongst a series of movies. Where it's like, they might as well be reading, like, ancient books when they're talking about the events that we actually saw take place in the movie. And it's like, the way these people who are no longer here and they only have these stories to go on, how even bigger these figures become in retrospect to these characters that never really knew them or met them. So I really like the concept of that scene. Like I said, maybe not necessarily the scene itself, but that idea and those characters having those conversations is very interesting, and has like a whole other sort of level to the first two. Like continues to heighten them as if they're not heightened enough as it is. Um, so there is that. But we do also have the whole Michael and Kay thing, which I know seems to go both ways. I've heard people say they like the Michael and Kay stuff, but I've also heard people say that they think it's too much of a detour from the second movie and where we left off there, and how it's like, and the whole idea of, Michael and being into legitimate businesses and stuff like that. And I think some people came into this wanting to see, like, ruthless Michael having become even more ruthless in his old age, when the opposite is happening. And I can see both of those, but it does feel a bit more, I don't know the adjective I'm looking for here. Like, natural was on the tip of my tongue, but I don't think that's it. But the idea that he's sort of winding down instead of, like, really, really growing, because um, we'll get into the details of that. But before, as far as, like, him and Kay's relationship specifically, like, there is that tension there, but at the same time, it is, like, when you look back at part two and how Michael, you could say descended or ascended, either way, to being one of, like, the big cinematic villains by part two, and, like, from the middle forward, and how that was, like, his whole solidified place. But then again, we are in a whole new period of time now, where he is sort of withering down. His diabetes certainly isn't helping, as we see. And how he's constantly wanting to get out anyway, with the line that's very, regardless of the shit that this movie gets, one of the most quoted lines of the whole trilogy comes from this movie with the, just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in thing. I don't know if people are specifically quoting Michael in part 3 when they do that now, or if they're doing Sylvia from The Sopranos doing Pacino doing it. It could be either one. But that would explain why the most hated part of the trilogy has a quote that has stood that long. But so as far as that goes, it does seem a tad out of place when you're thinking about his and Kay's relationship in the second movie. Especially, like, thinking about the abortion scene specifically, and their last scene with the door closing, which is even more foreboding than their last scene in the first movie. That's a door closing on Kay. But and here they're trying to do, like, the sort of rekindling thing, and he's trying to make himself seem less monstrous to her. But I think the reason that the K scenes work here, and them trying to almost find that again, because there is that awkwardness for a while. Like, there's definitely, the resentment is all still there, and it's still really weird at the reception. And then when we get to the middle here, and we get that moment where they meet up with Connie and Mary are there, and she, like, walks up and hugs Connie and says it's great to see her, walks up and hugs Mary, says it's great to see her, and then she and Michael have that, like, weird handshake. And then it kind of progresses into them just walking around together and doing this whole thing, which is probably where it loses some people. But I think the reason I don't mind the Michael and Kay scenes being the way they are, and, like, almost happy, is because we know in retrospect that he's just gonna lose her again, and how it's that kind of circle that keeps coming back around. That's the thing that he's not gonna get away from, is losing everything. So it's like he can get as close as he can to those moments of, this would be the sweet spot, this would be the happy place, and it's never gonna come, because all this stuff just keeps coming back, and that's the whole idea of it. So in that sense, like, knowing it's going to crash and burn and end in tragedy, that's because obviously we don't get anything after Mary's death, but it's especially given the last shot is our confirmation. Like people say it's an abrupt ending. There's a lot of confirmation in that one shot of old Michael at the end, where he's surrounded by nothing, and he's where he lost his first wife, and like it's just loss everywhere. So anything that he gains throughout this, or looks like he's going to gain throughout this, it's not going to be there by the end. So I feel like that might be what those scenes are really establishing. Potentially, I guess I can't always read Coppola's mind as much as material there is out there of him talking about this stuff, but I don't really look much at that stuff, because much as I would certainly respect Coppola's vision and where he's coming from, I also just like taking in movies the way I take them in. So sometimes it might kill it to look up a direct meaning or a direct intention or something like that. So I do that sometimes, but I try not to like all the time. If I just want to take a movie at my own value or something. But so yeah, talking about like one of the memorable quotes. This movie is full of those quotes, and like they may not have the weight of the first two movie, having like they're a whole fraction of the AFI list of 100 greatest movie quotes. Like the two Godfather movies are like their own, might as well be their own section. But here we've got stuff like there's that one. There's when Vincent's talking about wanting to throw Zaz out of the helicopter, and Michael says, "Never hate your enemies; it affects your judgment." Like that's these lines are very simple, but they go a long way, I think. And some of them might seem a bit like almost like they're really trying, like visibly trying to reach the memorable quality of the other two. But I feel like there's something here. Any of the stuff involving Fredo I find very interesting, and how that's been coming back to haunt him, where we get stuff like his whole confession when he says, "I killed my mother's son, I killed my father's son." That's an extremely powerful scene that doesn't really get the attention it deserves when you're talking about the whole trilogy and the memorable scenes in it. That's I would say that's one of the more powerful scenes of the whole trilogy, if that's not too controversial to say. And if it is, it's already said, so fuck it. So, and even that moment, it might seem a little melodramatic, but I always also kind of find it terrifying when he's having his stroke, and at the very last minute, he's just screaming Fredo's name. Like that, I find that scene terrifying, honestly. And like I said, that whole connection of everything coming back on him, because I like how, because obviously we end up back in Sicily at some point, so Apollonia keeps coming to the forefront of his mind, which he probably hasn't for quite some time, and it's just kind of being in this environment again, and that was always a tragic story also. And you can say Apollonia was more or less kind of a nothing character, but that's still always felt like a really, really tragic character and a really tragic storyline, because there was such an innocence about her compared to what Michael's life ultimately becomes, and what had just started, the whole reason he was there to begin with was the jumping off point, when he killed McCluskey and those guys. And one of the greatest scenes in movie history, that restaurant scene. So yeah, so there'll always be reminders here that, you know, as much as you try to push it out, there will always be reminders that there's just a certain heights that you're not going to top when you're trying to top two of the best movies ever made. But like I said, I've been saying there is stuff here. There's also the whole Zaza storyline, which I feel like is maybe a bit too short-lived. But still, it's for establishing Vincent as a character as we head in the directions we're going. There's something there. But what this sort of ties into is, I feel like, kind of the whole thing, where if you want to talk about the spiritual death of Michael. Because when you look at Vito in the first scene of the first movie, there's just that reverence from everybody. Like it's to the point to where when you see Brando in the first movie, especially in that opening scene, there's just something so intimidating even to us as an audience, and even no matter how many times we see the movie. But when you see the way everybody comes in and wants to do this, there's clearly a reverence and some sort of respect-based fear or fear-based respect, whichever way you want to look at it. There's the moment when Luca Brasi's sitting outside practicing how he's going to talk to him. May their first child be a masculine one. It doesn't seem like now in his old age Michael has that as much. Because if you really want to look at it, when you're looking at where he ends up and what his spiritual death is, which is what the Coda's title refers to, the fact that so many people in this movie tell him no in a way that you may not imagine people saying that to Vito. So when we get to the point to where Anthony doesn't want to do the lawyer thing, he wants to do the opera thing, and Michael tells him, that's out of the question, you've got to do the lawyer thing. And Anthony just straight up tells him no and leaves, just very firmly. And then, that whole thing where that's initially where Michael was coming from, and that whole thing, and how we might be finally cutting that circle off. And then there's the whole thing where he's confronting Mary about the whole Vincent thing, and he says, you just got to stop doing that. Like, it's, first off, your cousins, that's fucked up, and secondly, you just can't, like, from a business standpoint, you just can't. Like, from any possible there's no outcome of this that I can accept. So this has to end. And she just straight up tells him no to his face again, and then things happen like in threes, whether it be trilogies or acts to a story. 3 final no's for Michael. There is the beginning no from Anthony that's very final and goes in that direction. There is the final no from Mary that goes as far in that direction as she can get it. And then the third final no from Michael is begging for redemption. And that's the biggest no he gets of his life. And so thinking in this way about how Michael is, it'd be too much to say he's getting walked over. When you're comparing him to Vito, though, in the way the regard he was held in at this stage, but when you're looking at the way Joey Zaza is in this room, Joey Zaza is way too comfortable in that room. Like Joe Mantegna is so good in this, and it bothers me every time I just see him sitting in the room because he's just so confident when this should be a room where everybody but Michael has some kind of fearful respect going on, and Joey Zaza is just not that dude, which is a problem. So there's that whole thing where there's the overarching thing of this going in Vincent's direction, where Vincent eventually gets the Corleone name after he decides to end the whole Mary thing. But that feels like it's starting right away here in regards to Michael's not dealing with the Joey Zaza thing because he just doesn't take it seriously, because Joey Zaza is just basically a nobody to him. And it's Vincent, and obviously in Vincent's corner, Connie saying the Joey Zaza thing has to be dealt with. So when Vincent's the one that has to act, even if it's extremely reckless and in a very sunny way, the whole ear-biting thing, when he's clearly insulted again, like, that's how comfortable Zaza is in that room. I can't get over it. It's like that, him calling him a bastard one more time was so audible for anybody in that room to have heard it. That is a level of confidence you do not have in that room. So as far as Vincent making the call to take a chunk out of his ear and then ultimately plan his death and pull the trigger himself, it's clear there's like a power shift happening here that Michael may not even be aware of at the time. And so I feel like these arcs work throughout the movie. There are some things, and talking about Connie while we're at it, her whole arc where we look at her, and like we go all the way back to the beginning. Like the whole beginning of the very first movie is her wedding to fucking piece of shit Carlo. And then how we see where that marriage goes and the way she was treated, and how, like, it's one of the biggest blue balls moments in cinematic history when Sonny's gonna go over there and beat the shit out of him one more time and gets killed on the way there. It's one thing that Sonny got killed, but it's the reason it's so infuriating. And the fact that Connie now was that person, where there was like a lot of Adrian, her Rocky character, in there, where she was just kind of almost seemed like small and timid by comparison to everybody else, and then to see her in this one, partaking in the death of her own godfather, and just being this sort of, I mean, there's the really like operatic moment after Mary's been shot, where she puts the black veil on while she's like grieving in real time. But like the whole movie, she's just cloaked in black, like she's an angel of death, just like waiting to happen. It's almost like every time like every shot of her in the movie is basically building to the fact that she kills Eli Wallach eventually. And seeing story arcs like that are really great for these characters. So you can see where the missteps are, and I can see where a lot of people have their certain problems, and I have very similar ones. But I still feel like the highs in this are really, like, talking about the whole Vincent storyline. A scene I didn't even bring up yet was when Zaza sends those guys to his house when Bridget Fonda's there, and just the way he kills them is so relentless and so character establishing. Like, just really planting a flag in that movie, in the movie, and in his place in the storyline, to say that this is a character that is here to stay. Just that early on, like technically, if you consider the reception one scene, it's like his second scene. It's like goes right into that. And like if you want to talk about character establishing moments, that's right up there. And it's and Garcia brings it. It's not necessarily just the movie working, like, you know, like putting him up there like that. That Oscar nomination that he got is very well deserved, I think. And one of those things where, like, at first it might seem like it was like maybe a coattail nomination, where it's like, oh, they were just praising it because it was a Godfather movie, because it still got in like picture and director and like 6 other nominations or 5 other nominations. It might be easy to see, oh, Garcia was just, you know, roped into it for a nomination, but I can, like, the more I watch it, the more I can see where that's coming from, and just how much he really establishes himself in this character throughout the movie. And there's even some great, the whole helicopter scene, the helicopter massacre, is really good. It feels very, very big for these movies, compared even with how many massacres we've seen up to this point, how many murders we've seen up to this point. It still feels like a very, very big scene for this trilogy. But I don't know, it still works for me somehow. Like that first helicopter shot we get when Michael and Vincent are on their way looks like a shot out of Heat or something. Because obviously the photography on this, like the other two, is still incredibly top notch, especially the different locations. But what else is there? Because I want to talk about the climax, but I was trying to think if there's anything else. So let's talk about the climax, and we can wrap this up. I really like the climax. I think some people were confused by the editing, and the different locations for a while there. But when you grasp finally what's going on and who's there to kill who, I do really like the climax. It may not come together in the way that the other two do, but I still think it has its own effect. There are a couple of scenes I was really hoping the Coda would fix during the climax, and it was really unfortunate that they didn't, because it could have been really easy, because all they really would have had to do is remove audio. Because it's like, it's clear there's some different lines here, like just every now and then, like a line will change, like few and far between throughout it. But you could also just as easily take audio out, especially when it's a character that we don't even like necessarily, like they're in the shadows or something. Or in this case, when we're headed towards the climax and we're talking about who is where and how they're going to die and who's going to kill them. And I believe it's Vincent is narrating this and just taking it step by step through it while we're already building up to it. Once it's already building up to it, we're already in the moment. When the opera's going at full force, and we see all these characters here that need to be taken out, and we see all the characters that we know are going out for blood. I feel like there's more of an impact to just kind of watch it happen. Like, even if you don't know what it's building to, as long as you get a sense that it's building to something, the suspense is going to be there. And I think the main example of that in this whole climax is Neri on the train, because there's this moment here that I really wish they'd cut out. Was when he's got the box of like chocolate, and then underneath the thing, the gun is in there and the bullets are in there, and it's like the only reason Neri takes that out on camera is to show the audience that the gun is in there, and that's what he's on his way to do. And it's like, well, for starters, when you have all this cutting, and we've seen the other two movies, we know when we get to the end and something's happening and there's a lot of cutting between a bunch of different people, we know the deaths are coming. We get the structure now. That's the whole thing. That's the whole idea of setting up the world and the style, is because we're familiar with it now. And seeing Neri going to some location, like I said, we wouldn't necessarily know where if not for Vincent's narration that doesn't need to be there either. But I mean, we would know he was going to kill somebody, and the reveal of the gun being in that box, and where he was going and who he was going to kill, seeing that just unfold with nothing being shown to us beforehand except him just on his way with a box, would have been effective, would have been really impactful. So there's that, and then there's this really, it's what's really, it sets up nicely the kind of killer that Mosca is, like how deadly he is, and they talk about how like he never fails and stuff like that. And then to see him in action, it's like, because he looks like this, old dude, but then when he's in action at the opera, we see that this is a guy that has done this many, many times. This is a guy that has not failed killing people, clearly. But there's a really clumsy moment here with the twins. And it's really cool because when one of the twins goes in, and we see that, Mosca's just some old dude, we kind of get the sense that twin's going to take him out. And it'll be that simple. And then the fact that not only does he take the one twin out, he takes both twins out, is very cool for that character, and really shows off how deadly he is, that he gets both twins. But the way that's executed is so... And it may be a simple thing I'm dwelling too much on, but I mean, it's first off, that whole shot of him taking the dead twin and pinning himself against the wall to make it look like the twin has killed him. But it's clearly very awkward that both of them are standing here motionless. It looks weird. But that twin completely falls, the other twin completely falls for it. But here's a piece of audio you could have really cut out and helped this scene a lot. When the other twin walks up and says, "Oh, good, you got him." All that is that twin announcing to the audience, "Hey guys, I'm falling for this." And it's really awkward. And it's like, the climax is really good. Like, this whole setup, like, the way everybody gets off and the way it builds up to it is really good. But it is very suspense-killing when a scene like that is done as awkward as it is, or Neri has to show the audience the gun and says, "Look, but this is what I'm doing, just so you know." And the way he strokes the gun, too, is like really laying it on thick. So that's just little things that have bothered me that I really thought that Coda could have benefited from taking out, that for some reason they didn't. So that's unfortunate. But I couldn't quite remember where the gun moment was when he opens the box and strokes it. But I remember when I was watching the Coda, well, since I couldn't remember, I was like, I got the sense for a minute they might have cut it, and I got really excited. But it's still in there for some reason. It's like, of all the little tiny things they cut, because this version's only 157 minutes, 13 minutes less than this one, and like 5 minutes less than the original cut. So it's the shortest cut. So that's, I don't know. But, yeah, so basically already talked about the ending that they changed, where we don't see Michael Keelover, was like the big thing. And I remember it being really built up, that the Coda was going to have a really big, different ending. It was going to be a brand new scene and stuff like that. There was all that build up. It's like they added a quote, but the big thing is that Michael doesn't keel over. But I do think that's interesting because it completely redefines you know, the death of Michael Corleone in quotes, and sets it up for something much more. Because I know another thing that people say Sofia Coppola ruined was the emotional impact of Mary's death scene. Once again, I don't know that that one bothered me that much. It does seem like she just kind of got, like when you say an actor is playing a scene like they're practically brain dead or something because their delivery is just that flat. I mean, is like her delivery of "dad" is the last thing she said. Like she's literally dying in the moment. So there, I almost feel like it's. I don't know how much of a compliment it is to say that her best line reading comes from the fact that her character is basically dead. But that is followed by Michael's big reaction to this. His like the final nail in Michael's coffin, where it doesn't even matter if he dies or not, because like he's just kind of lost everything at this point. So we have that moment where we see everybody grieving, but then Michael has this moment when he has this silent scream. And the reason that I think it could be seen as overly dramatic, but the reason I love the silent scream is that it might seem at first like it's like as far as the audio goes, like a direct like Coppola's choice in the audio, where it's like the audio cut out entirely, like to where it's like Michael actually is screaming. It's just there's no audio. It's just all watching them grieve. But then you realize the audio is still there when he has another wave, and then it's an actual audible scream. And then when the fact that that silent scream was the build up to the audible scream makes the audible scream all the more how much you can hear the agony in it. And then taking us right into another moment, another choice that I'm not necessarily keen on that the Coda made, which was it just dissolves into him dancing with Mary, and then it dissolves into old Michael. I really liked what we got in the other one, where it was him dancing with Apollonia, and then dancing with Kay, and then dancing with Mary, and then he's old. Because it's like, not only were those like the main women in his life, but just to show that like, these are all the things that he lost as well. It just really adds that up in a way that just seeing him just dance with Mary by herself is like it's there, you get that, but it's very Mary centric, whereas the whole dissolve into old Michael is showing us that like everything is gone, so it makes sense to show Apollonia and Kay as well. So yeah, so I'm not sure what that choice was for, but I know some people have gotten quite bitter and say that the nepotism really took hold on this, and how it's like when directors direct their spouses, like they'll see something in that person that like nobody else sees, and that won't translate to film. Like that won't translate to a full audience. It'll just translate to that director. And kids probably more so. Like it's kind of like when a parent forces you to watch their home movies of their babies or something. Because I know that a lot of people were like, "Oh, the Coda, that sounds like a really good idea. Like he's gonna do a whole bunch of Coda. He's gonna take out all the stuff that we all hate." And then sure enough, Sophia is like dead center on the cover. So it's like you can see where he was clearly not going to let that go. Like if ever there was a way for a father to show that he loves his daughter, it's to hear all the things that have been said about Sofia Coppola's performance, and then Coppola says, "Fuck you, she's on the cover." But yeah. But as far as for the sake of the movie, I don't know. But yeah. So I don't know if there's much of anything else I have to say about either one of these, because like I said, as far as like ones that aren't like really nuanced, the big changes, there's really only a couple, but there are a couple that we knew going in that the beginning and the end would be different. And while that beginning one definitely helps a lot and gets us much more set off on the right foot than the other one does, I'm good with the ending where Michael doesn't keel over, because the death is clearly established on a spiritual level. But cutting out the Apollonia K dancing parts, I don't know. That kind of seems kind of contradictory to what that ending was going for. So I don't know. But yeah, so I think that's where I stand with this. So yeah, I'm like, regardless of everything I said, it's clear, like, there are people that say they just flat out hate Godfather 3, but I think more often than not you'll hear people say they think it's good. It's just the comparisons that do it in. So, and like I said, that getting off on the wrong foot and making the story feel very jumbled and disjointed probably doesn't help. But he's fixed it up a little bit here. So there's that. So I think that's really all I have to say on this one. So the next thing we're going to go into are a couple of 70s paranoid thrillers. And then after that, a series of movies, which I actually just mentioned earlier in this video. There's an actress they have in common. So we'll talk about those. And there's a couple of teen comedies I want to go into as well from different eras. And that'll pretty much be what the rest of this week is, on top of the new releases with Malignant and stuff like that. So until all that stuff, I think that's it.